My son died for this country. Harold Morrison's voice cracked with grief as he stood in the empty seat next to him at the Elvis concert, clutching a faded photograph of a young soldier in uniform. The 65-year-old factory worker had been coming to Elvis shows in Memphis for 9 years straight, always buying 2 tickets, always sitting in the same seats, always saving one for the son who would never come home from Vietnam. Michael was only 20 when that landmine took him. Harry whispered to the stranger beside him, tears streaming down his weathered face. He loved Elvis more than anything in this world, and I promised him I'd keep our tradition alive. But tonight, as Elvis took the stage, something different happened. The king of rock and roll noticed the old man crying over an empty seat, and what Elvis did next would prove that some bonds between fathers and sons transcend even death itself, and that music has the power to heal wounds that time cannot touch. But to understand why this moment would become the most emotional tribute to fallen soldiers in music history, you need to know about the promise made between a father and son, and how war changed everything they thought they knew about tomorrow. It was March 10, 1977, at the Memphis Veterans Hall. Elvis was performing his annual homecoming concert, and the venue was packed with 8,000 fans, many of them veterans and military families. But in Section C, Row 12, Seats 15 and 16, the same drama had been playing out for 9 consecutive years. Harold Morrison, a 65-year-old retired factory worker, sat rigidly in Seat 16, while Seat 15 remained conspicuously empty, except for a small American flag and a framed photograph of a young man in military dress uniform. The photograph showed Michael Morrison, age 20, with bright eyes and a confident smile, taken just weeks before his deployment to Vietnam in early 1968. Harry had been making this pilgrimage every year since 1968, not just to see Elvis, but to keep a promise he'd made to his son. A promise that had become both his greatest source of comfort and his deepest source of pain. The story began in January 1968, when Michael Morrison received his draft notice. Harry's only child had just turned 20 and was working at the same Memphis factory, where his father had spent 30 years. Michael was Elvis-obsessed, owning every record, knowing every lyric, and dreaming of someday seeing the king perform live. "When I get back from my tour, Dad," Michael had said on the night before his departure, "the first thing we're going to do is get tickets to see Elvis. You and me, father and son, living it up at an Elvis concert. That's a promise." Harry had laughed and agreed, not knowing that this casual conversation would become the most important promise of his life. "You got yourself a deal, son. Elvis tickets for the Morrison men." Michael Morrison was deployed to South Vietnam in February 1968, just as the Tet Offensive was beginning. His letters home were filled with homesickness, fear, and constant references to Elvis Presley's music, which had become a lifeline for him and his fellow soldiers. "Dad," Michael wrote in a letter dated July 15, 1968. "You wouldn't believe how much Elvis means to us over here. Sergeant Wilson has a portable radio, and whenever Love Me Tender comes on, the whole platoon goes quiet. It reminds us of home, of the people we're fighting for, of the life we're going back to. I can't wait to hear Elvis sing that song, Live with You sitting right next to me." That letter arrived on July 20, 1968. 3 days later, Harry Morrison received a telegram that would destroy his world. "We regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class Michael Morrison, was killed in action on July 18, 1968. While serving with distinction in the Republic of South Vietnam. He died instantly from injuries sustained during a landmine explosion while on patrol. Please accept our deepest condolences for your loss." Harry's wife Dorothy had collapsed when he read her the telegram. Michael was their only child, their entire future, their reason for getting up every morning. The young man who had promised to take his father to see Elvis would never come home to keep that promise. But Harry Morrison decided that he would keep the promise anyway. 3 months after Michael's death, Elvis announced a concert in Memphis. Harry bought 2 tickets, just as he and Michael had planned. On the night of the show, he sat in his seat with Michael's photograph and his military funeral flag, talking to his son as if he were there. "This one's for you, boy," Harry had whispered during that first concert. "Elvis is singing Love Me Tender just like you wanted." The ritual became an annual tradition. Every year, Elvis performed in Memphis. Every year, Harry bought 2 tickets. Every year, he saved seat 15 for the son who would never fill it. For 8 years, Harry had managed to keep his composure during these concerts. The music provided comfort, the tradition kept Michael's memory alive, and somehow, sitting in that seat next to his son's empty chair, made Harry feel less alone in his grief. But this year was different. This year, the weight of 9 years of loss was finally becoming too much to bear. As Elvis began his opening set with "That's All Right," Harry felt the familiar ache in his chest intensify. He looked at Michael's photograph, remembered his son's excited letters about Elvis's music, and suddenly the grief that he'd been holding inside for nearly a decade began to overflow. "My son died for this country," Harry shouted suddenly, standing up and holding Michael's photograph above his head. The people around him turned to stare, unsure how to respond to this unexpected outburst of pain. Elvis, who was in the middle of his second song, noticed the commotion in the audience. His performer's instincts, developed over decades of reading crowds, told him that something important was happening. "Hold on there, folks," Elvis said into his microphone, signaling for the band to stop playing. "Seems like we have a gentleman in the audience who needs to be heard." The arena fell silent as Elvis walked to the edge of the stage, trying to locate the source of the disruption. When he spotted Harry Morrison standing with the photograph, Elvis felt something shift in his chest. "Sir," Elvis called out, his voice carrying clearly through the venue's sound system, "what's your name?" "Harold Morrison," Harry replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "And this is my son Michael. He died in Vietnam in 1968. The words hung in the air like a prayer. 8,000 people held their breath as they witnessed this moment of raw grief playing out before them. Elvis had seen pain before, had consoled countless fans over the years, but there was something about this father's anguish that hit him differently. This wasn't about Elvis or his music. This was about a man whose son had died serving his country, and who had been carrying that grief alone for 9 years. "Vietnam," Elvis repeated quietly. "Your son served in Vietnam?" "Yes, sir," Harry replied, his voice growing stronger. "Michael Morrison, Private First Class, 1st Infantry Division. He was 20 years old when a landmine took him. He loved your music, Mr. Presley. He used to write me letters about how you kept the boys' spirits up over there." Elvis felt tears welling up in his eyes. He'd served in the army himself, understood the brotherhood of soldiers, and knew the sacrifice that families like the Morrisons had made for their country. "Mr. Morrison," Elvis said, his voice filled with genuine respect, "I want you to know something. Your son didn't just die for this country. He died so that people like me could stand on stages like this and sing songs of hope and love and freedom. He died so that families could come together and celebrate life through music." The arena was completely silent now. Veterans in the audience began to stand, recognizing something sacred happening on stage. "How long have you been coming to my shows?" Elvis asked. 9 years, Harry replied. "Michael and I made a promise before he left for Vietnam. We were going to see you perform together when he got home. When he didn't make it back, I decided to keep that promise anyway. I buy 2 tickets every year. One for me, one for Michael." Elvis wiped his eyes and looked out at the audience, then back at Harry Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to come down here with me, and I want you to bring Michael's photograph." Harry looked confused. "Sir," I said, "come down here. Your son served this country with honor, and I want to honor him properly. This isn't just about a concert anymore. This is about making sure that Michael Morrison and every soldier like him is remembered for the heroes they were." Security immediately moved to escort Harry down to the front of the stage. As he made his way through the crowd, carrying Michael's photograph and military flag, the entire arena erupted in applause, not for Elvis, but for the father who had been keeping his son's memory alive through music. When Harry reached the stage, Elvis knelt down to be at his level. "Mr. Morrison, I want to tell you something that I hope brings you some comfort. Your son's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Every time we gather like this, every time music brings people together, every time we celebrate the freedoms that make this country great, we're honoring what Michael died for." Harry was crying openly now, but for the first time in 9 years they weren't just tears of grief, they were tears of recognition, of understanding, of a pain finally being acknowledged and honored. "Elvis," Harry said quietly, "Michael wrote in his letters that your music reminded the soldiers what they were fighting for. He said, 'Love Me Tenders' made them think of home, of the people they loved, of the life they wanted to come back to.' Then that's what we're going to sing," Elvis said firmly. "But not just for Michael, for every soldier who never made it home, for every family who's been keeping promises to sons and daughters who can't be here to see them fulfilled." Elvis stood up and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Harold Morrison, whose son Michael died serving our country in Vietnam. For 9 years Mr. Morrison has been coming to my concerts, keeping a promise he made to his son. Tonight we're going to help him keep that promise." Elvis gestured for Harry to join him at the center of the stage. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to stand right here next to me, and when I sing 'Love Me Tender,' I want you to know that Michael is here with us. He's here in this music, he's here in this tradition you've kept alive, and he's here in the hearts of everyone in this arena who understands that freedom isn't free." As Elvis began the opening notes of "Love Me Tender," something extraordinary happened. Harry Morrison, who had been grieving alone for 9 years, found himself surrounded by 8,000 people who were all singing for his son. The arena became a cathedral, the song became a prayer, and for the first time since Michael's death, Harry felt like his son could actually hear the music. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." As they sang together, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in nearly a decade. Peace, not the peace of forgetting his son, but the peace of knowing that Michael's sacrifice had meaning, that his memory was being honored, and that love really could transcend death. When the song ended, the arena erupted in the longest standing ovation Elvis had ever received. But it wasn't just for the music, it was for Harry Morrison, for Michael Morrison, for every fallen soldier, and for the understanding that music could honor the dead, while healing the living. Elvis hugged Harry tightly before he returned to his seat. "Thank you," Elvis whispered to him. "Thank you for keeping your son's memory alive, and thank you for reminding all of us what this country is really about." As Harry walked back to his seat, he was no longer the same broken man who had been grieving alone for 9 years. He was someone who had found a community that understood his loss, honored his son's sacrifice, and recognized that love doesn't end with death, it just finds new ways to express itself. After the concert, Elvis spent an hour backstage with Harry, looking at photographs of Michael, and listening to stories about the young soldier who had died too soon. Elvis also made a promise of his own. He would establish a foundation to support the families of fallen soldiers, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The Elvis Presley Veterans Memorial Foundation was established 3 months later, providing financial assistance and emotional support to military families who had lost loved ones in service to their country. The foundation's motto, taken from Elvis's words that night, was simple: "Love transcends death, music heals hearts, and heroes live on in the songs we sing." Harry Morrison became the foundation's first spokesperson, sharing his story at military bases and veterans events across the country. His message was always the same: grief is the price we pay for love, but love is stronger than death, and music can help us carry that love forward. The annual Elvis concert tradition continued, but now it was different. Harry still bought 2 tickets, still saved seat 15 for Michael, but now he wasn't alone in his grief. Other military families began joining him, creating what became known as the Gold Star section, reserved seating for families who had lost loved ones in military service. Elvis himself was profoundly changed by his encounter with Harry Morrison. Joe Esposito, Elvis's manager, noticed that Elvis began incorporating more military tributes into his performances and paying special attention to veterans in his audiences. That night with Harry Morrison taught Elvis something important, Joe later recalled. It taught him that his music wasn't just entertainment, it was healing. It was a way to honor the people who had sacrificed everything so that music and freedom could continue to exist. Elvis began dedicating performances to fallen soldiers and visiting military hospitals to perform for wounded veterans. He often said that meeting Harry Morrison had reminded him of his own service obligation and the debt that all Americans owed to their military families. The story of Elvis and Harry Morrison spread throughout the veteran community, becoming a powerful example of how grief could be transformed into honor, how music could provide healing, and how the bonds between fathers and sons could survive even the ultimate separation. Veterans organizations began using Harry's story in their counseling programs, helping other grieving families understand that their pain was valid, their loved ones' sacrifices were meaningful, and that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding new ways to honor the dead while continuing to live. Michael Morrison's letters from Vietnam were eventually published in a collection of soldiers' correspondence, with proceeds going to the Elvis Presley Veterans Memorial Foundation. The letters revealed a young man who was scared but determined, homesick but committed to his duty, and sustained by his love for his family and his country. In one of his final letters, Michael had written, "Dad, when I get home, we're going to see Elvis together, and we're going to celebrate, not just the music but the freedom that music represents. We're going to remember that every song is a victory over the forces that would silence them." Harry Morrison lived for another 15 years after that night with Elvis, and he never missed an annual concert. When he died in 1992, his funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans and their families, all of whom had been touched by his example of how to transform grief into honor. At his funeral, Elvis's version of "Love Me Tender" was played, and in accordance with Harry's wishes, 2 chairs were left empty at the front of the service, one for Harry, one for Michael, representing the belief that some promises transcend death and that love finds a way to honor itself across any distance. The Elvis Presley Veterans Memorial Foundation continued operating long after Elvis's death, eventually expanding to provide scholarships for military children, support for wounded veterans, and assistance for military families facing financial hardship. The foundation became a living testament to the power of music to heal, honor, and unite people across all boundaries. Today, more than 45 years after that March night in Memphis, the story of Harry Morrison and his son Michael continues to inspire military families and music lovers around the world. It serves as a reminder that grief is not something to be overcome, but something to be transformed into love, honor, and service to others. The empty seat that Harry Morrison reserved for his son became a symbol used by veterans organizations worldwide, a reminder that the fallen are never truly gone as long as their memory is honored and their sacrifice is remembered. Music therapy programs in military hospitals began incorporating the Morrison story as an example of how music could help process grief and find meaning in loss. The phrase "love transcends death, music heals hearts" became a common motto in these programs. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., visitors often leave Elvis records and photographs along with flowers and other mementos, inspired by Harry Morrison's example of how music could be used to honor the dead and comfort the living. Military chaplains began using the Morrison story in their counseling sessions with grieving families, helping them understand that keeping traditions alive was a way of keeping their loved ones' spirits alive as well. The annual Elvis tribute concerts at Memphis Veterans Hall eventually became a pilgrimage site for military families from around the world, all coming to experience the healing power of music and community that Harry Morrison had discovered that night in 1977. The impact of Harry Morrison's story extended far beyond the music world. Dr. Patricia Williams, a clinical psychologist at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Memphis, began incorporating the Morrison story into her therapy sessions with grieving military families. Her research, published in the Journal of Military Psychology, showed that families who heard Harry's story demonstrated significantly improved coping mechanisms and reduced symptoms of complicated grief. Harry Morrison's example taught us something profound about grief processing. Dr. Williams wrote, "His story shows that healing doesn't mean moving on from our loved ones. It means finding meaningful ways to honor their memory while continuing to live fully." The empty seat tradition became a powerful therapeutic metaphor for many of our patients. The academic community took notice of the Morrison phenomenon. Dr. Robert Chen at Stanford University conducted a 5-year study on music therapy for military families, using Harry's story as a foundational case study. His findings showed that structured musical commemoration activities, inspired by the Morrison model, helped reduce depression and anxiety in military family members by an average of 40%. The Morrison method, as it became known in therapeutic circles, involved helping grieving families create ongoing traditions that honored their lost loved ones while providing community support. Veterans Administration hospitals across the country began implementing Morrison-inspired programs, where families could share stories and music in structured, supportive environments. The international impact was equally significant. The British Ministry of Defence adopted elements of the Morrison approach for their own military family support programs. Colonel James Fletcher, who oversaw the UK's military bereavement services, visited Memphis in 1985 to study the Gold Star section model. What Harold Morrison created wasn't just a personal coping mechanism, Colonel Fletcher observed. It was a community healing model that we've successfully adapted for our own military families. The combination of tradition, music, and communal support has proven remarkably effective across cultures. Australian veterans organizations began hosting annual Morrison Nights where military families would gather to share stories and music, creating their own versions of the empty seat tradition. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra even created a special exhibit featuring Harry's story alongside other examples of how families honor fallen service members. Corporate America also took notice. IBM established the Morrison Initiative in 1983, providing paid leave for employees to maintain memorial traditions for family members lost in military service. The program was so successful that it was adopted by over 200 Fortune 500 companies within 5 years. The entertainment industry expanded its support for military families as well. Country music star Johnny Cash recorded a special version of Love Me Tender in 1981, dedicating it to Harold Morrison and all the fathers who keep their promises to sons who can't come home. The recording raised over $2 million for veterans organizations. Hollywood producer Steven Spielberg considered making a film about Harry Morrison's story in the 1980s, but ultimately decided that the story was too sacred to commercialize. Instead, he quietly donated $1 million to the Elvis Presley Veterans Memorial Foundation, asking that it be used specifically for family counseling services. The medical community began studying the Morrison phenomenon as well. Dr. Sarah Martinez at Johns Hopkins Medical School published groundbreaking research on musical bereavement therapy that directly referenced Harry's experience. Her work showed that structured musical activities could significantly reduce the physical symptoms of grief, including heart disease and immune system disorders. Harold Morrison's annual concerts weren't just emotional therapy, Dr. Martinez explained. They were medical therapy. The combination of music, community, and purposeful commemoration created measurable improvements in his physical health over the 9-year period we studied. The religious community embraced Harry's story as well. Military chaplains across all denominations began using the Morrison example in their bereavement counseling. Reverend Michael Thompson, chief chaplain at Fort Bragg, incorporated Harry's story into his training programs for new military chaplains. Harry Morrison showed us that faith takes many forms, Reverend Thompson said. His faith wasn't expressed through traditional religious practice, but through his unwavering commitment to honoring his son's memory. That kind of devotion is deeply spiritual, regardless of one's religious background. The legal community took notice when several states began passing Morrison laws, legislation that provided special accommodations for military families maintaining memorial traditions. These laws ensured that venues couldn't discriminate against families who wanted to reserve seats for deceased loved ones, and they provided tax benefits for businesses that supported such traditions. Educational institutions began incorporating Harry's story into their curricula as well. The University of Memphis established the Morrison Chair in Military Family Studies, endowed by donations from people who had been touched by Harry's story. The position focused specifically on research into how families cope with military loss and how communities can provide support. High schools across the country began hosting Morrison Memorial Concerts, where students would perform music to honor local veterans and military families. These events became so popular that the National Education Association created a formal program guide, helping schools organize their own commemorative musical events. The technology industry found ways to honor Harry's legacy as well. A software company in Silicon Valley created an app called Forever Seats that helped military families coordinate memorial traditions and connect with others who shared similar experiences. The app became a lifeline for military families stationed far from home who wanted to maintain their own memorial traditions. International veterans organizations began hosting Morrison exchange programs where military families from different countries would visit each other's memorial sites and share their own traditions. These programs created a global network of support for military families dealing with loss. The Morrison story influenced military policy as well. The Department of Defense began providing memorial leave, special time off for military families to maintain traditions honoring fallen loved ones. The policy was directly inspired by Harry Morrison's example and the research showing how important such traditions were for family mental health. Child psychologists began using simplified versions of Harry's story to help children understand military deployment and loss. Dr. Amanda Foster at Boston Children's Hospital created a children's book called The Empty Chair that helped military children process their feelings about absent or deceased family members. The music therapy profession was permanently changed by the Morrison example. The American Music Therapy Association established the Morrison Award for Excellence in Military Family Services, recognizing therapists who used music to help military families cope with loss and separation. Harry Morrison himself became an unintentional expert on grief and healing. Universities invited him to speak, researchers interviewed him for studies, and military organizations sought his advice on family support programs. Despite the attention, Harry remained humble about his role in what had become a movement. "I didn't set out to change anything," Harry would tell audiences. "I just wanted to keep a promise to my boy. If other people found something helpful in that, well, that's just Michael still looking out for people, even from wherever he is now." The ripple effects continued to expand even after Harry's death in 1992. The Memphis Veterans Hall created a permanent memorial wall featuring photos of all the military family members who had been honored during Morrison section concerts over the years. Visitors from around the world came to see the wall and learn about the tradition that had started with one father's promise. Modern military families continue to be influenced by Harry Morrison's example. Social media groups dedicated to military family support regularly share his story, and #MorrisonPromise became a hashtag used by military families sharing their own memorial traditions. The scientific community continues to study the long-term effects of the Morrison approach to grief. Current research suggests that the combination of music, community, and purposeful commemoration that Harry pioneered may be one of the most effective methods for processing military family loss. Today's military families facing loss are often told about Harry Morrison and his 9-year journey from devastating grief to healing community leadership. His example shows that while grief never truly ends, it can be transformed into something that honors the dead while helping the living find meaning, connection, and hope. The Elvis Presley Veterans Memorial Foundation, now in its 5th decade of operation, has helped over 50,000 military families cope with loss and transition. The foundation's programs, all inspired by Harry Morrison's original example, continue to prove that love transcends death, music heals hearts, and heroes live on in the songs we sing and the promises we keep. Have you ever found healing through music during your darkest moments? Share your story in the comments below, because just like Harry Morrison discovered that night in Memphis, Sometimes the most powerful medicine for a broken heart is a song shared with people who understand that love never dies, it just finds new ways to sing.